Hey folks, Erin Zaffini here. Welcome back to the channel, Teaching to a Different Beat. I'm so glad that you're here. If you're not sure exactly where to start when it comes to tackling issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, if it all just seems too much for you, I always say, start really, really small. Start so small, start with just one lesson. And so here today, this video is called Level Up Your Lesson. Taking a lesson and figuring out ways I would recommend that this lesson could be leveled up. Here we go. Okay. So when I think about the idea of leveling up lessons, these are the things that I am constantly thinking about, questions that I'm asking of teachers that I'm working with, things that I'm looking for in a lesson that could easily level them up. And they're all surrounding the idea of equity. What do equity-minded teachers do in the classroom all the time to make their teaching, make their lesson just more accessible for students? So some of the things that I'm looking for in a lesson plan are students' different academic needs being met. Are their social and emotional needs being met? Those are two very important sets of needs that have to be met for learning to actually take place in a classroom. Where is student voice and choice being centered? I'm looking for student-centered, forward-thinking lessons in that regard, centering student voice, centering student individuality. Very much along the same lines, honoring student culture and identity. Where is that happening in the lesson? Where do we see this idea of an 80-20 split? And what I mean by that is 20% of any kind of given lesson, the teacher is leading everything for 20% of that time. However that equates in this specific context for you and your teaching. But then the other 80% of the time of any class meeting, any lesson, are students doing things with what you're teaching. They're engaging with it in different ways. They're engaging with each other. They are experiencing things on different levels. They are being assessed in different ways. That is really student-centered. And so a simple rule of thumb that I try to impart upon my students and teachers is this idea of just teach less so your students can do more. If you think about that all the time, how can you be teaching less? How could you be front and center less so that way students can interact with the material more? That is student-centered teaching. It might not be 80-20. If we can bump it up to 60-40, that would be awesome. If we're not there yet, strive for 50-50. And then maybe the next week, 60-40. Keep striving for teaching less so students can do more. I'm going to take this idea of equity-minded teaching. I'm going to apply this lens onto a lesson so you can see my thought process on how we can level up a lesson. First, I would like to thank Sean P. out in Philadelphia. He was so wonderful to give me this example of a lesson that he's currently working on right now for the spring with his fifth graders, specifically on musical form. And Sean admitted to me that he actually uses ChatGPT a lot for his lesson planning ideas. He was worried about sharing that with me, but I guess all I just want to say about ChatGPT is ChatGPT is not this terrible thing. I think that there are wonderful things that ChatGPT can be used for. I don't know actually if this is one of those lessons that he created with ChatGPT, but it's a good starting point. So let's walk through this together so you can kind of see the process of applying an equity-minded lens to a lesson so we can level it up. So I can see here that Sean, this must be, okay, fifth grade. He did tell me it was fifth grade. 40-minute class. So this is the context. It's a 40-minute class for fifth grade general music. And the objectives here, by the end of the lesson, students will be able to define musical form, identify and differentiate between common musical forms such as ABA, B, rondo, analyzing musical pieces to recognize their form and create their own short musical compositions using basic forms. Okay, So I already have a question for Sean. When I think about equitable teaching, I think about students' needs academically, as well as social and emotionally. And my wondering for you, Sean, and I know that you're watching this because I'm using your lesson for this, but my wondering for you is, do you think that you're going to be able to actually do all of these things in a lesson in a 40-minute time period? My personal thought is that you won't be able to do it, or at least you won't be able to do it really well. And so if things can't be done well, that kind of undermines this idea of meeting students' academic needs for pacing, meeting students' social and emotional needs. If we're trying to make things accessible for our students, sometimes we shouldn't be rushing through. That causes stress, that causes a lot of anxiety for students. This to me feels like a lot. And so I'm just going to kind of put a comment in here and say, how are students' social and emotional needs being met in this 40-minute, because it is a 40-minute class, I can see, 40-minute class time frame. So that's the first thing that kind of jumps out at me. My recommendation for leveling up this particular part of the lesson plan is to really think about that idea of teaching less so students can do more. I love that Sean, I've been working with Sean for a while, but I love that Sean here is trying to think of doing more. I love that, but maybe do more with fewer things. So instead of differentiating between AB, ABA, and rondo form, maybe just pick AB and ABA form. Instead of maybe, having students go into creating their own musical compositions, maybe table that for a little bit later in the process. So that way this is not a full one and done lesson, which I think is what's trying to happen here. So kind of thinking about what can you do more with in a reasonable amount of time. So that's something I also want to just kind of highlight. Okay, materials, whiteboard, markers, interactive whiteboard software. I love that we have this interactive whiteboard software. Technology is really important. You have to be integrating technology as much as possible. Examples of musical composition with clear forms. Cool. My question for this teacher is, what examples are you using? And is this a spot where we can actually honor student culture and identity? Can we dip into the cultures of our students in this particular class and use music that is representative of them as examples of musical forms that you're trying to highlight? So can we honor student voice and choice here? Okay. Can we dip into those cultures? So that's another way to level it up. I love that we're going to have multiple compositions. Let's level it up by making sure that we are inviting our students' culture into the room when it comes to that kind of thing. Optional musical instruments such as keyboards, xylophones, recorders for composing activities. I love it. I don't think that should be optional. I think that should just be required. So yes, I love this. Make this required. And of course, like I said, bump the composition to a different day. I'm making a lot of assumptions here about this lesson plan. I'm assuming that this is kind of an introduction to musical form for fifth graders. Introduction. Here we have sequencing, beginning the lesson by asking students if they've heard of the term musical form. This answers my question. This is a starter lesson for musical form. Briefly discuss their thoughts. Define musical form as the structure, introduce the concept. So I am seeing in this introduction, this to me would constitute, if we think about that 80-20 split, I feel like this is the 20% of the teacher being front and center. So this in itself is not terrible. Things that I would like to understand a little bit more is maybe you can actually have students connect with each other a little bit about discussing their thoughts. Because even though this is very teacher-centered, this introduction part, there's access points for students to be able to share what they think about when it comes to musical form. Do they have examples? How can you actually even embed some student-centered conversation with each other in this introduction section. So I already love this exploration of musical forms. I love this idea of exploration. I see that Sean has this for 20 minutes, so let's see what the plan is. Presenting examples of different musical forms using recorded music or notation on the whiteboard. I would say choose recorded music first, as opposed to notation on the whiteboard. I am going on the assumption that we can't assume that all of the students in 5th grade can read musical notation. That's actually a barrier for a lot of students. So if the idea is not to be reading notation necessarily, but to be able to identify musical form, we can definitely do that orally for sure. So I would say maybe not do musical notation yet, but maybe later. Play a piece with AB, a simple folk song, play a piece with ABA. I see we have theme and variations, and I also see rondo form. Okay, great. Same idea here. Play a piece, but make room for student voice, student agency, and honoring student individuality, right? Culture. So these are examples, right? This part here is still also teacher-centered to me. So now we're starting to dip in a little bit into too much teacher, but let's just see how the lesson keeps going here. Discuss each form, AB form, ABA form, rondo form. Okay, all of this whole section here, this whole 20-minute section that we've got going on here, this all seems very teacher-centered. So my one thing would be to ask this teacher, how can we level it up? How can we make it more student-centered so that way it's less teacher in front of the classroom? How can students be engaging with each other, with you, with instruments? How can we embed this during this section? Because now we have, I think, almost 30 minutes of teacher-centered instruction, and that's a very long time in one chunk, specifically for 5th graders. Okay, so teach less, do more. Analysis activity. I'm not sure what this means. Let's see. Divide students into small groups, provide each group with a short musical piece, and ask them to identify its form. Use pieces from the examples or simple melodies after analyzing. So this is kind of like an experiential thing, but also a formative assessment piece. My thought is that this is formative. This cannot be summative yet because you are just starting out with musical form. Okay, so thinking about those academic needs, we jumped right from here's an example of musical form to here we are going to kind of assess it. I'm going to see if you kind of get it. Before we do a little bit of assessment, I would say have them do more experiential learning with it. More experiential learning. Things that work really well with understanding musical form specifically are movement activities, visual reinforcing activities, oral reinforcement. Those kinds of things really lend themselves well to students being able to engage with musical form a little bit better. So how many ways can they learn about musical form before you go right to students identifying musical form? Put in some steps along the way. Put in some more steps that will help be more accessible and more equitable for students. Application and creativity. Here we are. We've jumped right into creating, composing. First of all, I love the idea that this teacher is thinking about that important strand of creating and composing. It is one of our standards. It's really necessary to do that. I would say in the context of this lesson, don't do this yet. I did say this earlier, but don't do this quite yet. How many times do we jump from here's what something is, memorize the terminology, and then skip. Now we're going to compose something in such a short amount of time. Let's give some space for exploration some more. So I would say take this whole section, move it to a later day. In fact, maybe even a couple of days later, so that way students can really experience the depth of musical form, and then they could really create and be successful with creating when they finally really do get it in the way that you would need them to understand something and show that understanding in a way that they can then create meaningfully. So I would just say, I'm going to highlight this. Usually when I work with teachers, I'm going to highlight orange as in maybe not now. Maybe we don't do this now. Conclusion, recap of everything. So, okay, this is exactly where I thought that this lesson was going to go. So I love this idea. I love the idea of musical form. It's perfect for fifth graders. I love the idea of varying the types of compositions that are being studied. Leveling this up, I would recommend these things. I would recommend pacing a little bit differently. I would recommend teaching fewer concepts that are associated with musical form so students can experience it more before just jumping to composing. So we have really good verbs here, though. We have identify. That's a great verb. I like identify. I like that we also have the word explain. In fact, one of my favorite things about this lesson that I'm seeing is nowhere do I actually see, oh, I do see it. Here it is. Understanding. Use that word understanding. Tread carefully with that word understanding, because we don't know what that looks like. However, something that helps out with this lesson is this idea of identifying and explaining. It's not enough to just say students will understand. Sean actually went through and said, this is what understanding looks like in this lesson, identifying and explaining. So I appreciate that very, very much. That's a really great thing about this lesson. So these are just examples of ways that we could level up this lesson. How are we representing the different learning needs of students? How are we meeting those social and emotional needs? And how can we take these ideas of different musical examples and bring in students' individuality, honoring student voice and choice, honoring students' culture? Those are really good ways to level up this lesson. And like I would recommend for a lot of beginning teachers, we're trying to cram in a lot of things into a shorter amount of time. It's okay if we don't cram so much in. Let's do just a little bit, and we just do that really well. We're going to rock the little bit that we're going to do. We're going to be so awesome at it. And then we're going to do something else later, and we're going to do that really, really well. That's really going to be student-centered, really student-facing, and really hitting those needs. So I did give a lot of feedback on that one lesson. I think that sometimes we give so much feedback that we're not sure what to do to start. Out of all of that feedback, I would just pick one thing, pick two things, and just focus on those things. Don't worry about everything else. Just pick a couple things and do that the best that you can. That's how growth happens. Little steps, not major leaps all the time. It really is little steps that we practice every single time. If you like this video, please take advantage of the fact that I have a free resource for all of you. I have a free resource that does talk a lot about student-centered teaching. It is the 5 innovative practices that you can do today in a music classroom to just really innovate your classroom. Take advantage of that. That link is popped down there for you below. If you have any questions about this video, if you would like to actually submit a lesson that I can then do as another example of leveling up your lesson, I'm happy to take those as well. I hope you're having a great day. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.